There are stories that are told by mouth, but there are others, rare, profound, almost forbidden, that can only be told with the heart. The story you are about to hear is one of those. It's not about fame, spotlights, or obvious glory. It's about abandonment, about waiting, about a silent cry that crosses generations until it reaches the ears of God. Ishmael, a name that few remember, but which carries within it the eternal sound of divine listening. God listens. He was Abraham's first son, born not from a heavenly plan, but from a human attempt to hasten God's time. Fruit of pain, sterility, despair. A boy thrown into the world amid broken promises, looks of contempt, and a silence that screamed louder than any words. But what if I told you that it was in this silence that God spoke the loudest? That in the middle of the desert, where everything seemed lost, a new promise was sealed. That the one who was expelled from the camp was, in fact, being led to his true destiny. Ishmael is not a mistake. He is a sign. He is the answer. He is living proof that even when everything seems to go wrong, heaven still has something to say. If you've ever felt invisible, forgotten, excluded from some promise, this is your story. If you have ever questioned God's timing, or if you have ever tried to fix with your hands something that can only be solved from above, then you will see yourself here. Because Ishmael is not just an ancient name buried in the pages of the Old Testament. He is a symbol. He is a mirror. He is redemption in human form. Get ready to cross the desert with him, feeling the thirst of the soul, the weight of rejection, but also the miracle of provision. This is a story of family conflicts, of decisions that hurt, of promises that seem to take time, but that never fail. A journey where the sky bends to touch those who have been left aside. You're about to witness something powerful, and once you get into this story, there's no going back. It all started with silence, a heavy silence, dragged on by years of waiting. Abraham and Sarah were no longer young when the divine promise arrived, but time passed, and nothing happened. Sarah's sterility turned into daily pain, an open wound that not even faith could hide. And then, faced with emptiness, doubt came, desperation came, and along with them, a human decision. Sarah, tired of waiting, had an idea, handing over Hagar, his Egyptian servant, to Abraham so that he could have a son through her. It was a custom of the time, yes, but still, it was a shortcut. An attempt to help God fulfill what he himself promised. And when we try to do this, the result is always complex. Hagar got pregnant, and everything changed inside that tent. Hagar's pregnancy didn't bring relief, it brought tension. What seemed like a solution became a trigger of pain. The previously silent environment was filled with hard looks and unspoken words. Sarah, now more hurt than ever, realized the weight of the choice she had made. And Abraham, trapped between two women and a pending promise, was plunged into a dilemma that affected his faith and his humanity. Ishmael's birth was not celebrated with trumpets or dancing. It was shrouded in anguish, confused expectation, and uncertainty. But there he was, Abraham's first son. He who, even though he was not the son of the original promise, was the flesh of the patriarch, a sign of continuity, an inheritance in the form of a boy. And yet, the feeling was that something was still missing. What to do when the divine promise seems to take too long, when time hurts us and waiting tests us? Ishmael's story is born exactly in this place, between the faith that resists and the doubt that insists. It is the result of a moment of haste, but also of a very human moment, because even the greatest of faith stumble, and it is in this stumble that many extraordinary stories begin. And perhaps that is why Ishmael has so much to teach us, because he was not born at the ideal time, nor under ideal conditions, but it was born. And God saw him, God accompanied him, God wrote your story anyway. This shows us that even when we try to rush heaven with earthly solutions, divine grace continues to act, sometimes silently, but always sovereignly. Hagar, now pregnant, started to look at Sarah in a different way. The once submissive look had become haughty, filled with a certain silent contempt. After all, she was carrying Abraham's son, something that Sarah, the legal wife, never achieved. And that hurt more than words could describe. It was as if every morning the servant reminded the lady of what she could not be. Sarah, consumed by a resentment that grew every day, stopped seeing Hagar as a solution and started seeing her as a threat. The environment has become unsustainable. It was impossible to live with the pain of feeling replaced in your own home. Then she started acting tough, sharp words, merciless orders, constant humiliation, all to hurt back. And Abraham? He watched this clash in silence, torn between the son that would come and the woman with whom he shared an alliance. Sometimes the greatest war is not against external enemies, but against internal dilemmas that we don't know how to resolve. He loved Sarah, but he couldn't ignore Hagar. And each gesture, each choice, seemed to light the fuse of the conflict even more. Hagar couldn't stand it. The home, which should have been a shelter, became an emotional prison. And then, pregnant and injured, she fled into the desert. He took no supplies, no plans. It only took pain. This escape wasn't just physical. It was a desperate attempt to escape from a place where she no longer had dignity. A silent cry for help. And the desert responded. What seemed like just a domestic conflict was, in fact, a reflection of something much bigger. The wounds we carry when we decide to rush God's plans. The rivalry between Hagar and Sarah is a mirror of what happens when we allow pride and insecurity to dictate the direction of our home. Untreated emotions become storms, and no one emerges from them unscathed. But God was watching. Even when tension turned love into bitterness, He saw. Even when family ties are broken by thoughtless choices, He is there. Because behind the scenes of the conflict, heaven was already preparing a response. And this is the next chapter of this story, a chapter where the desert will become a place of revelation. Hagar walked aimlessly. The sun burned his skin, and the hot desert wind seemed to mock his pain. Pregnant, exhausted, and rejected, she carried nothing but the bitter memory of cruel words. She was a wounded woman trying to survive in a world that had turned its back on her. And right there, where everything seemed to end, something supernatural happened. The sky tilted to hear the cry of a servant. It was next to a source of water in the midst of aridity that the angel of the Lord appeared. Not with fury, but with compassion. He called her by name. That, in itself, was already a miracle. To be recognized, be seen, being called out when the world discarded her. The angel not only knew who she was, but he also knew her story. And in this encounter, God revealed that nothing, absolutely nothing, goes unnoticed before him. The promise was clear. I will greatly multiply your descendants, who will not be numbered, as numerous. Ishmael had not yet been born, but he was already the target of a heavenly inheritance. His name was revealed there in that divine conversation. Ishmael, God hears. Every tear of Hagar, every sigh of pain, every step in the desert, God heard it all. And that absolutely changed the course of history. The name carried identity, mission, destiny. Ishmael would not be just another son lost in the desert. He would be the father of a nation, a landmark that God does not forget those who are despised. This intervention was more than a promise. It was a rescue of dignity. Hagar, who before was just the Egyptian servant, was now the mother of a boy named by heaven, and that reconfigured everything. Hagar's experience teaches us that deserts are not just places of suffering. They are also scenarios for transformative encounters. God could have spoken to her in Abraham's house, but he chose the place of pain to manifest his grace. Because there is something sacred about being found when we are lost. It is at the bottom of the well that God's voice echoes loudest. And so, carrying a new promise in her heart and a new name on her lips, Hagar returned. She returned not because the environment had changed, but because she had been changed, And inside him, he now carried a boy who represented not just survival, but a destiny built on divine hearing. But this story is still far from over. Hagar returned to the tent, not as the same woman who left. Her steps were still those of a servant, but her spirit already bore the mark of an encounter with the divine. And in due time, Ishmael was born, a strong boy, wrapped in promises and with a name that resonated as a testimony. God listens. Abraham welcomed him with affection, and for a time, peace seemed possible. Ishmael grew up between the tents of a patriarch and the suspicious eyes of Sarah. He was Abraham's son, but not his wife's, and this, even if veiled, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. There was love there, yes, but there was also tension. After all, Ishmael was a living reminder of a human plan that tried to compete with the divine promise. This made every day a tightrope. Abraham saw in Ishmael his inheritance in progress. He taught him to shepherd, to build altars, to listen to stories about the God who had called him to leave Ur. He was his firstborn, and with him, Abraham shared the weight of the future. But deep down, he knew the full promise had not yet manifested itself, and this knowledge shaped their attitudes with caution and apprehension. Ishmael, in turn, was just a child trying to understand why his existence was such a delicate matter. He loved his father, respected his mother, but he grew up feeling half inside and half outside, as if occupying borrowed space. This is how many grow up, with enough love to live, but not enough to feel like they fully belong. And that marks a soul. Even so, God was not absent. He followed Ishmael's every phase, every breath, every step, because even when we don't understand the role we play, heaven is already writing chapters that our eyes cannot yet reach. The boy grew, and with it, the impact of his story also grew, even if it was not yet recognized by everyone around him. Life between Sarah and Hagar continued to be tense, but Ishmael continued to be formed with the attentive eyes of the God who hears. He was not the son of the pact, but he was already part of a much larger plan, a plan that would not be nullified by human jealousy nor erased by domestic silence. And what was to come would test everything that had been built up to that point. Time passed. And then what many no longer believed happened. Sarah became pregnant. Against all human logic, against the biological calendar, against what anyone could imagine, the impossible happened. The son of promise was born. Isaac arrived with laughter, celebration, and admiration, but for Ishmael, that changed everything. From being the beloved firstborn, he became the middle child who has no place. Sarah now had what she always wanted, and with Isaac in her arms, she looked at Hagar and Ishmael with different eyes, eyes of protection, but also of possession. She wanted to secure her son's future, and to do that, I needed to remove any shadow of threat. The previously stifled tension turned into open rejection, and all it took was one gesture from Ishmael, a joke, perhaps mockery, to ignite Sarah's fury. "Drive out this servant and her son," she said to Abraham, with the coldness of someone willing to protect what is theirs, whatever the cost. Abraham was torn apart. How can you send away the child who grew up in your arms? How can you take a piece of yourself out of your life? It was one of those moments when faith and emotion collide, and neither path seems right. But then God spoke, and his words, however harsh, brought direction. "Listen to the voice of Sarah, for in Isaac your descendants will be called." Still, God did not forget Ishmael. On the contrary, he reaffirmed, "I will also make a great nation out of the son of the servant." This order was not an abandonment but a redirection, a necessary rupture so that two destinies could flourish. Abraham, with a heavy heart, prepared bread, water, and a goodbye that hurt like a hot iron in the soul. Hagar and Ishmael left. The boy, now a teenager, carried on his shoulders the weight of a rejection he did not provoke, expelled not for who he was, but for what he represented. And sometimes the greatest suffering is exactly there, being judged not by your actions, but by the threat that your existence imposes. But until then, God was leading, because the most painful separations often pave the way for greater revelations, and Ishmael's story would not end with expulsion. She would just change the scenery, and in this new desert, what seemed like the end would become the soil of an even grander promise. The desert is unforgiving. The heat, the loneliness, the absolute silence, everything seems to scream that the end has come. Hagar walked with Ishmael at her side, but there was no direction. The bread is gone, the water dried up, and with that, hope began to die too. Hagar placed the boy under a bush and walked away. "I don't want to see the boy die," she said. It was at that moment that heaven heard once again. Ishmael's voice rose like a cry, not an elaborate prayer, not a pretty speech, just a moan, a sigh from someone who no longer has the strength to fight. And it was enough, because God doesn't need perfect words. He responds to broken hearts. An angel appeared again, and his first sentence broke through the despair. "Fear not, because where there is fear, God's presence brings courage." God heard the boy's voice, not the woman's voice, not the voice of Abraham, the boy's. That says it all. The boy who was rejected by the house, expelled by the promise, forgotten by men, was remembered by God. And at that very moment, God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw what had always been there, a well of water. Because sometimes the miracle isn't sent, it's revealed. With fresh water and new hope, Ishmael revived. He drank, strengthened himself, and took his first steps towards his own destiny. The desert, which seemed like an end, became a starting point. God didn't just sustain Ishmael's life. He reactivated his promise, and in this gesture, the sky shouted to the world, "I do not abandon what I have generated." Ishmael was not leftover. It was choice. That day, the desert lost the right to be synonymous with death. Because God proved that it is there, exactly where there is nothing, that he reveals everything. Hagar held her son with new eyes, and Ishmael, even though he was young, carried within himself the mark of someone who was supported directly by heaven. The test of faith did not end in tears. It ended in a miracle. From that day on, the boy would grow up far from Abraham's tents, but under God's continuous care. The desert was his school, his furnace, his temple. And this is how God forms those who will be great, not in comfort, but in necessity, not among crowds, but in solitude. Because before Ishmael could be the father of a great nation, he had to learn what it was like to depend on every drop of divine provision. Ishmael's story is more than an ancient tale. It's a powerful spiritual lens. He shows us that God is not limited to those who bear the official title of promise. Ishmael was not the son of the covenant with Sarah, but he was deeply seen, heard, and blessed. This breaks many paradigms. God also acts outside the spotlight. He moves among the forgotten, the rejected, those who walk alone. Ishmael represents all those who grew up on the margins, but who still have purpose. He is a symbol of grace that transcends the borders of religion and tradition. His name is a living reminder that God hears, even when no one else does. This is a lesson that touches anyone who has ever felt invisible, because God's spirituality is not limited to the tent of the perfect. She invades the desert of the broken. Another powerful lesson is in the way God intervenes. He did not prevent Hagar from being expelled. He didn't avoid the desert, but it appeared at the most critical moment. This shows us that faith is not the absence of pain. It is the divine presence in pain. Ishmael's redemption did not come through logic. It came out of compassion. It came because of the care of a father who doesn't give up even when everyone else turns away. Ishmael's heritage also teaches about identity. Even though he was different from Isaac, he was no less worthy of destiny. God promised to make him a great nation, and he fulfilled it. This reveals to us that promises can coexist, that blessings are not exclusive, and that each child has a unique path to follow. Comparing only creates pain. But understanding that there is room for everyone is healing. Furthermore, Ishmael shows us that the value of a life is not in how it began, but in how it is sustained. It was the result of human error, yes, but it was supported by a divine promise. This resets everything. God's grace does not cancel out where you came from. It confirms where you are going, and this completely changes the way we see our own trajectory. Ultimately, Ishmael's greatest spiritual lesson is simple and overwhelming. No one is beyond God's reach, nor the rejected one, nor outside the original plan, nor what was born in a moment of doubt. Everyone has a place at the table of heaven, and that truth still resonates today, calling each of us to look at the Ishmaels of life with more compassion and at ourselves with more hope. How many times do we try to rush God's action? Abraham and Sarah decided on Hagar because they were tired of waiting. And the truth is that in many moments we do the same. We make decisions out of desperation and not out of direction. We create our own emotional, financial, spiritual Ishmaels. But God, in His infinite grace, does not abandon us because of this. He transforms even shortcuts into new paths to redemption. If you feel like Ishmael, forgotten, rejected, pushed aside by other people's decisions, know one thing: God listens. He not only hears your cry, but acts on your behalf at the exact moment. Your pain is not invisible. Its desert is not ignored. And His name, like Ishmael's, can carry the mark of a reunion with the divine promise. It's not the beginning that defines you. It's God's intervention in the middle of the journey. And if you identify more with Sarah or Abraham, perhaps dealing with the consequences of impatient decisions, there is still time to turn back. God does not cancel plans because of our mistakes. It realigns them. All it takes is humility, faith, and a willingness to obey even when your heart hurts. Abraham's obedience in expelling Hagar was not coldness, it was faith. Faith that God would take care of both sides of the promise. Ishmael also teaches us about the strength that is born in the desert. Sometimes it is in abandonment that we discover God's embrace. It is when the ground disappears that the heavens reveal themselves. Don't run away from the desert, cross it with courage. Because it is there that God opens sources invisible to hurried eyes. The provision already exists. What is often missing is the perspective that only comes when the soul surrenders. Furthermore, we need to learn to look at others with God's eyes. There are many Ishmaels around us, people bearing marks of rejection, who have been taken from places where they were once safe. What kind of voice have we been for them? The one that expels or the one that welcomes? Ishmael's narrative calls us to be channels of restoration, not exclusion, of mercy, not of judgment. Finally, may this story challenge you to trust, even when you don't understand. Waiting, even when everything seems delayed. To love, even when there is conflict. And to keep moving forward, even when the road is uncertain. Because the same God who heard Ishmael's cry still hears. And maybe today, He is listening to yours too. Ishmael's story forces us to look within. It exposes our haste, our judgments, our escapes, but it also reveals the God who hears, the God who sees, the God who does not give up even when everything seems lost. Ishmael was expelled by human hands, but welcomed by heavenly arms. And perhaps you, like him, have also been pushed away by circumstances you have no control over. But the question remains, can you see the source that God opened right before you? Or are you still convinced that you were abandoned in the desert? The answer is not in the circumstance, but in listening. God still hears, still guides, it still transforms. And perhaps now is the time to get up, drink the living water, and walk towards your destiny. What are you going to do with all this? Will you continue to allow your pain to define your identity? Or will you allow God's grace to give new meaning to even your darkest chapters? Ishmael's story shows us that it's never too late to start a new cycle, even when everything seems dry. Are you hearing His voice? If this story spoke to you, share in the comments what touched your heart the most. What part of the desert are you crossing? What promise are you still waiting for? Let's grow together. God still writes stories, and yours could be next. Subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and follow each new story we reveal here, because whoever hears the word transforms their life.